Good morning and welcome. This is an interesting Irish history. Today, we're going to look at Irish slavery in America. So, sit back, relax, smash that subscribe button, and enjoy today's tale as we learn all about Irish slavery in America. This is a huge topic, and there is lots of controversy, just like the Irish genocide, where there is a lot of controversy around it. But I think it is something that needs to be shared and needs to learn about, because it is an important part of Irish history, and this is the slavery that happened to the Irish people. So today we'll touch on it, if you will. One of the main books that we have that is a great source of historical documentation and archaeological evidence of Irish slavery comes from the book To Hell or Barbados, and the book is written by Sean Callahan and reveals the truths behind the Irish who were sold into slavery. I will include the link to the book in the comments below. So now let's dive right on into it. After the Battle of Kinsale in 1601, the English had captured some 30,000 military prisoners and thus created an official policy of banishment or transportation. James II encouraged the selling of the Irish as slaves to planters and settlers in the New World colonies. The first recorded sale of Irish slaves was to a settlement on the Amazon River in 1612. In 1625, an official proclamation ordered for the Irish prisoners to get rounded up and sold as slaves to English planters. Between 1629 and 1632, a large number of Irish men and women were sent to Ghana, Antigua, and Montserrat. By 1637, approximately 69%, that is 69% of the population of Montserrat were Irish slaves. Negro slaves had to be purchased 20 to 50 pounds sterling. Irish slaves were captured and sold for 900 pounds of cotton. The Irish became the largest source of slaves for English slave traders. From 1641 to 1652, over 550,000 Irish were killed by the English, and 300,000 were sold as slaves. As more men were transported, leaving their wives and children behind, they too also rounded up and were sold as slaves. Irish women and their daughters were of lighter complexion than black slaves and were considered more valuable as domestic slaves. In 1649, Cromwell began a campaign of terror in Ireland. All captured soldiers were transported to be sold into slavery. A few months later, in 1650, 25,000 Irish were sold to planters in St. Kitts. During the 1650s, over 100,000 Irish children, generally from 10 to 14 years old, were taken from their parents and sold as slaves in the West Indies, Virginia, and New England. In fact, more Irish were sold as slaves to the American colonies from 1651 to 1660 than the total existing free population of the Americas. Let that sink in for a second. More Irish slaves were sold to American colonies between a 9-year period than the total existing free population in the Americas. That's huge right there, that there were more slaves between those 9 years than there were free people in America. In 1652, Cromwell ordered the Irish that they were to be transported overseas, starting with 12,000 Irish prisoners sold to Barbados. The infamous "To Hell or Conquest" proclamation was issued on the 1st of May, 1654, confiscating all Irish-held lands, and the native Irish were to relocate west of the Shannon or be transported to the West Indies. To expedite this process, in 1657, the law was further clarified to read, "Those who fail to transplant themselves into Concord or Cochlear within 6 months shall be attended of high treason and will be sent into America or some other parts beyond the seas. Those banished who return are to suffer the pains of death as felons by virtue of this act, without the benefit of clergy." It was not a crime to kill any Irish, as soldiers were encouraged to do so, but the slave trade proved too profitable to ignore. As a result, 52,000 Irish were sold to Barbados and Virginia alone. Another 30,000 Irish men and women were taken prisoners and ordered transported and sold as slaves in 1656. Cromwell's Council of State ordered that 100 Irish girls and 1,000 Irish boys be rounded up and taken to Jamaica to be sold as slaves to English planters. Still, there were more, as little records were kept on this activity for obvious reasons. Very few people realize that from 1600 and 1699, that's in a 100-year period, more Irish were sold as slaves than Africans. Let me say that again. Take it in because this is important. From 1600 to 1699, more Irish were sold as slaves than Africans. Servant indentures were a mutual agreement whereby a servant, would sell a period of time in exchange for passage. In return, he would receive housing, food, clothing, and usually a piece of land at the end of the term of service. But that was for them, not the Irish. The Irish were more often an exception. Sometimes slavery was not recorded as such, or not recorded at all. From 1625, the Irish were sold with one purpose: as slaves. There was no indenture agreements, no protection, no choice. They were captured and turned over to shippers to be sold for their profit. The profits were huge. 900 pounds of cotton for an Irish slave. Everyone in the slave trade from Ireland made a profit. Well, except for the slave. Irish and African slaves were housed in the same facilities, and were the property of the plantation owner. The planters had to pay more for a black slave. African Negroes cost generally about 20 to 50 pounds of sterling, compared to 900 pounds of cotton, about 5 pounds sterling for an Irish. And the blacks were treated better. The Pope and all Roman Catholics were considered an enemy of God and civilization. Any infraction was treated harshly and severely. Many Irish died as a result of the treatment. It was not a crime to kill an Irish slave, merely a loss. However, Parliament saw the need to enact certain protection for slaves. It took until 1677 for the Parliament to pass an act to regulate the treatment of slaves on British plantations, designating and authorizing punishments to include whippings and brandings for slave offenses against a Christian. Irish Catholics were not considered Christians, so these protections did not apply. The planters began breeding the Irish women because it was profitable. Children of slaves were themselves slaves. Planters then began to breed Irish women with African men to produce more slaves, who had lighter skin and brought higher prices. In 1681, legislation was passed forbidding the practice of mating Irish slave women to African slave men for the purpose of producing slaves for sale. Not out of moral consideration, of course, but because slave traders saw it as competition. In 1691, following the Battle of the Bayonne and the defeat of King James, the Irish slave trade had fresh supply of captives ready to transport. For the next 100 years or more, the policy remained with transportation of Irish men, women, and children to be sold into slavery, a policy of ethnic cleansing. Now, where have we heard that before? Finally, in 1839, a bill was passed in England forbidding these activities, bringing the Irish slave trade to the end. So it took from 1600 to 1839 for the Irish slave trade to end. That's 200 years that the Irish were held in slavery. So next time you hear about slaves, just remember the Irish. If you haven't, please smash that subscribe button, because it helps me to be able to produce this content, especially if you really like it. I encourage any and all comments in the comments section and do my best to answer them. So please, feel free to comment on the material, adding insights and stuff learned, what you liked, what you didn't.